Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating and honestly kind of mind-blowing historical mysteries of the early Christian church, the intensely controversial legacy of Origen of Alexandria. We're going to explore his life, his deeply radical ideas, and the fierce theological disputes that still surround him today, as we uncover the story of a man who was caught right in the crossfire between human philosophy and divine mystery.
So let's start with a massive paradox. How on earth does a deeply pious thinker, a man who literally wrote the very first major theological textbook for the early Christian church, somehow become officially branded a heretic? How does someone who was considered a guiding light of orthodoxy end up banned and condemned over 300 years after his death? It's a gripping historical puzzle, for sure. So here's our agenda for today. We'll start with the paradox. Was he a church father or a heretic? Then we'll dive deep into his doctrine of universal reconciliation, check out the massive influence of Plato on his work, weigh the whole biblical versus philosophical debate, and finally look at his ultimate condemnation.
All right, part 1, church father or heretic?
And the context here is absolutely crucial. You see, Origen wasn't some sort of fringe rebel looking to cause trouble. He was a deeply devoted scholar and a strict ascetic. In fact, when he was young, his father was actually martyred for his faith, and Origen earnestly wanted to join him. He was only stopped because his mother literally hid his clothes so he couldn't leave the house. He was that dedicated. Just look at his timeline for a second. Born in 185 CE, he lived this life of rigorous study and eventually died in 254 CE from complications after being severely tortured for his faith. He died a faithful believer. But then, look at the end of that timeline, 553 CE. He gets condemned at the Fifth Ecumenical Council. That is a staggering 3-century gap between his life as a revered teacher and his official branding as a heretic. To understand why, we've got to look at exactly what he was teaching. Which brings us right to part 2, the doctrine of universal reconciliation. Okay, the core of this whole dispute really comes down to one dense Greek term, apokatastasis. Basically, this is the doctrine of universal reconciliation. In Origen's view, nobody, and I mean nobody, is ultimately lost forever. He proposed that eventually, all of creation, every single soul, would come to its senses, be purified, and be totally reconciled with God. Now, he thought it might take eons, maybe even multiple lifetimes across different worlds, but eventually, everyone would freely choose to return to their Creator.
Now, you might be wondering, did he just make this up? No, he rooted this controversial belief deeply in biblical scripture. He pointed specifically to texts like 1 Corinthians 15:28, which talks about a time when God will be all in all. For Origen, this meant a complete, total victory of God's love, a time when even former enemies willingly submit to him, not because they've been defeated and crushed, but out of genuine, heartfelt reconciliation. The way Origen structured this journey is just fascinating. First, souls stray from God. Second, they undergo what he called catharsis. You see, Origen didn't view hell as this place of eternal punitive torture. Actually, scratch that, he saw it more like a medical treatment. The eternal fire was really a self-condemning conscience meant to educate and rehabilitate the soul. And third, this painful rehab eventually leads to a voluntary return to God. Freedom of choice was absolutely integral to his theology. God provides the opportunity, but the soul has to freely choose to rise again. Moving on to part 3, the influence of Plato. To really grasp where his theology came from, we have to talk about Alexandria in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. It was a massive hub of Hellenistic culture. Middle Platonism was the oxygen of all cerebral processes in Alexandria. Think about that. The point here is that an earnest Christian living in this environment couldn't help but absorb Platonic concepts. It was literally the intellectual air they breathed. So Origen naturally used this philosophical language to try and explain divine mysteries.
But hey, we have to be careful not to say Origen just copied Plato. Where Plato believed in multiple abstract ideas and thought souls chose new bodies just to eventually escape the physical realm entirely, Origen adapted this into a distinctly Christian framework. He argued for a single personal God revealing himself through Jesus Christ. And for Origen, the physical body wasn't just some gross prison to escape from, it was a necessary training ground, a place to practice virtue.
Which leads us to part 4. Was he being biblical or philosophical? During what later became known as the Origenist controversy, several heavy-hitting early church figures vehemently attacked Origen's theology. We're talking leaders like Epiphanius of Salamis, Theophilus of Alexandria, Jerome, and Shenote the Archimandrite. These guys led the charge. They saw Origen's blending of Middle Platonism with scripture not as a helpful enrichment, but as a deeply dangerous corruption of the Orthodox faith.
And what exactly were they so upset about? Well, their grievances were substantial. First off, they absolutely hated the idea that souls pre-existed and fell into human bodies, arguing this made human reproduction sound like the result of a cosmic mistake.
Second, the scandalous implication of apokatastasis, the idea that even the devil, yes, the devil, could eventually be saved and reign in heaven. And third, they accused Origen of denying a strict bodily resurrection. Origen thought the resurrected body would be a highly refined spiritual body, which his opponents felt totally undermined the physical reality of the resurrection.
Now, how would Origen have defended himself against all this? In his own writings, specifically in his book De Principiis, Origen explicitly stated that many of these controversial ideas were meant as rhetorikering, basically an exploration, a dialectical exercise, a thought experiment. They were never meant to be taken as strict dogmatic doctrine. He was just trying to push the boundaries of understanding to explain the inexplicable. But his later critics, they completely ignored this nuance and treated his exploratory thoughts as rigid, punishable heresies.
And that takes us to our final section, the ultimate condemnation.
Fast forward 3 centuries after he died, a faithful confessor of the church, and the political and theological winds had shifted entirely. At the Fifth Ecumenical Council in 553 CE, under the heavy influence of Emperor Justinian, Origen's speculative ideas on pre-existent souls and apokatastasis were officially criminalized. The texts from the council explicitly condemn the fabulous pre-existence of souls and the monstrous restoration. Just like that, Origen was officially branded a heretic.
So we circle back to the ultimate irony of his legacy. The author of the foundational Christian textbook, the guy whose catechism guided the church for centuries, becomes its most famous heretic. Here was a devout man, tortured for his faith, who was ultimately punished by history just for trying to bridge the gap between human philosophical logic and divine mystery. Sure, his later followers might have taken his ideas way further than he ever intended, but it was Origen's name that bore the stain.
And that leaves us with a final, provocative question to chew on as we wrap up this explainer. When we look at Origen's brilliant and incredibly daring synthesis of Middle Platonism and early Christianity, we really have to ask ourselves, does blending secular philosophy with religious faith actually enrich our understanding of the truth, or does it inevitably lead us down a path toward heresy? It's the question that defined Origen's entire life, and honestly, it's one that still echoes in theological debates today. Keep exploring, and thanks for joining me.